and New York City's water system. Tom has unearthed an almost limitless amount of historic written accounts, drawings, photos, which he shares as a walk leader, lecturer, and curator exhibitor. He is also a talented photographer. Currently, Tom's virtual exhibit about the aqueducts, how New York became the Empire City, can be found on the website of the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct at aqueduct.org. Let's begin our walk through aqueduct history with Tom. Take it away.
Tom, you need to unmute yourself and let me share my screen and get our slides up, okay? Tom, is that okay? Tom, you may be muted. Tom?
Chet, if you're the host, you can unmute him.
Okay, I just found me. Tom, you need to unmute, Tom.
Okay, how about now?
Now you're great.
Okay, good afternoon, virtual hikers. Today we will take a virtual tour of the Old Croton Aqueduct from north to south. But first we'll open with a look at the most substantial structure in Irvington and a few things surrounding it. Unless you plan to walk in place as you watch this, you can take your hiking boots off. The first slide that we see here is one of a few variations on the aqueduct tunnel. It's a rendering, the only rendering that shows human forms in the aqueduct. And it's a good one to see because it gives you a good idea of the scale of the brick tunnel through which the water flowed to New York starting in 1842. This is a depiction of how they would have tunneled through an earth part of the aqueduct, not through rock or in trenches as some of the other variations would be. And this is a part of an uncollected or unprocessed collection at the Library of Congress, although this slide was digitized for me at my request by a very cooperative archivist at the Library of Congress. The next slide is a variation and pretty much the standard profile of the aqueduct itself, 7.5 feet wide, 8.5 feet high on the interior dimensions, supported on a fairly narrow concrete base with reinforcing stonework on the outside, on the bottom half of the aqueduct, because that is the only part of the aqueduct up to about a 5-foot height that would have held water. The arched portion on top was never planned to be used to put water through the aqueduct and consequently was not reinforced to withstand the pressure from the inside. Although in later years, the water was let into within 12 inches of the height of the arch, causing many maintenance problems, as you might imagine. And we can go to the next slide, which shows a map. The yellow tabs on the left show where the keepers' houses were. Those would be superintendents' houses, or keepers, as they were called, along the route of the aqueduct. And the blue line extending from the most northern part, where the reservoir was at the Old Croton Dam, held about 2 billion gallons of water, which curved around the Croton River and then followed a route down the bank of the Hudson all the way through Westchester and through what became parts of Yonkers and the Bronx into Manhattan, all the way down to 42nd Street, where there was something called a distributing reservoir. The most southerly reservoir before the water was distributed southward from that to the island of Manhattan in its built up section, pretty much south of 23rd Street for the most part in 1842. We can go to the next slide, Chet. Now we're back in Irvington, 17 miles from the dam, the original dam, showing the Station Road underpass as it looked in 1842 in a book written by Fayette Bartholomew Tower, one of the engineers on the project. He wrote this book in 1843 with many illustrations in it, showing most of the major components and most impressive architecture in the system. You can see the Station Road underpass, and you can see a culvert for a stream parallel to it. And the top-hatted gentleman in the illustration give you a time, kind of a time clock as to when this illustration was done. Our next illustration is the title of Fayette Bartholomew's book, and I would recommend to anybody this primary resource, which can be found on the internet at any of the digital libraries and it's widely available. You can download the entire book and read through an excellent preview or prelude introductory essay in the front about Roman aqueducts, on which the Croton Aqueduct was based, it being a gravity-driven aqueduct, similar to the Romans 2,000 years before. Next slide, Chet. Here's the next important work in Irvington was the Jules, Brook, and Ravine. And according to this report, contemporary with the building of the aqueduct, it was 17.5 miles from the dam. The foundation wall on the aqueduct at this point had to be 50 feet high before they could even build the brick tunnel on top of it. And at the end of this paragraph, it says it was one of the most arduous undertakings on the line, not the most arduous, but one of them, and is finished in a manner that does great credit to the contractors. And it describes in a little more detail the road and stream culverts. Next slide, Chet. This is a view that most of you in Irvington would know today, similar to that original tower illustration, the road culvert and the stream culvert next to it. The only difference being now that the entire embankment has grown up with somewhat mature trees all the way to the top. And there are some reinforcing embankments of stonework built in a step-up shape at the base of the aqueduct embankment. And that was because for such a high structure, it began to bulge outward and sag after a number of years, and the reinforcements were necessary here in Irvington and in some other places as well, where the embankments were fairly heavy. Next slide. The road culvert itself. We can scroll through these, Chuck, Chet, at about a 5-second interval, just for various views of the embankment, winter and summer, and the step-up reinforcements are more visible. This is an illustration, a isometric cutaway that shows all of the conduits in this particular section, the roadway, the culvert underneath, and the aqueduct up on top that you can see on the top of this very high stone wall built across the valley there. And so there was a fairly concentrated bit of engineering, and a lot of work went into it in this one spot. The culvert for the stream, obviously, and we can keep going. And in the summertime, electric lights have been added, obviously, for the one-way road that it is. And these the next two slides show just a close-up of some of the beautiful geometry of the design and the very finely cut stonework that were part of the structure, with the additional embankment for reinforcement shown there in the background. Now, everybody who's walked on the aqueduct has seen one of these ventilator towers. This one is in Irvington, and it's a entrance ventilator. You can tell that by the square of gray cement on the bottom, which is in that rectangular shape. Used to be a door that engineers and maintenance men could enter, go down a flight of stairs into the aqueduct for maintenance and repair, which in the early years they did twice a year. The aqueduct had to be emptied out twice a year, probably spring and fall. And there would be maintenance people in there traveling pretty much the entire length of it in various sections, looking for any deterioration in the interior brickwork. Most of it held up pretty well in the early years, and it didn't require extensive renovation or maintenance until after they overburdened the aqueduct with more water than it was designed to carry. And we can continue. Here's a architectural drawing of what an entrance ventilator would look like, slightly offset from the aqueduct tunnel itself. This one shows an exterior staircase, which I don't think were built in any case. The interior staircases might have been moved in later plans inside the aqueduct so that people weren't tempted to open the door and go into the aqueduct on their own. Next slide. The views in Irvington are particularly good. This is just one very beautiful house along the Aqueduct Trail in Irvington. And many of you may know about the Octagon House as well, which is even a more beautiful site, it being such a particular and interesting and original kind of architecture on the trail. And next one, people obviously use it as a place to walk their dogs. I think the lady in this picture might be a subscriber to the New York Times based on the blue plastic bag that she is carrying for her dogs. Our next photograph, kind of a photograph, illustration is of John B. Jervis, the chief engineer of the project, who was hired by New York City as the second chief engineer after the first one was let go for having some personality and working problems with the water commissioners. Jervis had a long history of projects dealing with the aqueduct from his time as an axeman, chopping down trees for the line of surveyors for the Erie Canal. This particular description of the line of the aqueduct from the Croton Dam is a good one because it mentions the wild region of the Croton. And in 1842, and during the time of its construction, from 1837 onward, it was the wild region of Westchester, being probably less populated by people than by apple trees or cows. And the original name of the reservoir was the Croton Lake. We can move to the next slide. There's an illustration from another contemporaneous book at the beginning of the aqueduct history, showing the original dam.
Oh my God, Kathy's on here.
The original dam showing in two sections. The newer section shows a curved spillway, which had to be built after part of the earthen embankment of the dam was washed out in a flood almost immediately after it went into service. And the curved spillway was able to handle much more of floods, some of which were 6 or 8 feet high over the top of the dam. And again, the top-hatted gentlemen and long-dressed women give you a very accurate look at here's an architectural drawing of the design for that replacement section of the dam. A curved spillway with a stilling basin.
Oh my God, Kathy's on here. This is so funny.
And you're not muted.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, the stilling basin caught the water as it went from a vertical to a horizontal direction as it went down the face of the dam, and preserved the dam from being scoured out or undermined at the bottom during a large overfall of water. You can also tell that the dam has a base or a foundation of wooden cribbing with just loose stones in the wooden cribs, followed by loose stones on top of that to the general shape of the dam, and then much more finely cut stones interlocked on the surface. And that was actually a very good design and seems to have lasted. It's still there, only under 30 feet of water today, behind the impoundment of 30 billion gallons of water behind the modern New Croton Dam, which itself was built and completed in 1905. Here's a circa 1905 photograph of the dam from a different angle showing the gatehouse, which still exists, though minus its roof. And the paving in front of the gatehouse is actually built directly over the aqueduct as it exits the reservoir and the gatehouse and makes its way to New York City. Next one, Chuck. Here's a 1955 photograph of the old dam when it was last exposed after a large hurricane, and when the water in the New Croton Reservoir was lowered 40 or 50 feet, possibly even more, to inspect the New Croton Dam. So in this, what I call the Leave It to Beaver photograph, based on the father, mother, and son in the photograph in 1955, shows the original section of the flat-faced dam where the water could travel down without being slowed, as opposed to the curved face on the left that was much more safe in terms of dam design. The curved face became a standard design in dam building after that for many years, after John B. Jervis's initial design of it. And the next one will show a very rare photograph of a monument over the intake to the Croton Dam Gatehouse. Good story here. The man in Pennsylvania who found it in a family shoebox of old photographs did not know what it was, did a little bit of research, and then reached Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct, basically to ask the question, is this anything? And it was one of those holy mackerel moments to the members of my group when they first saw this monument, because there's no other good picture of it that exists today. It's mostly hidden by brush and weeds. It was moved up the hill about 30 feet after this photograph, when the new Croton Dam was built and the 30 feet of water inundated the old dam. They actually took time to take this monument apart, move it up 30 feet on the hillside, and reconstruct it. It's visible, but in very difficult ways. Here's a 1909 image at the same location, the old dam just underwater here. And we're looking across the Croton River at the 1890 Gatehouse, which juts up under the Quaker Bridge, which is just across it. Or actually, it's not called the Quaker Bridge, it's called the Thunder Bridge, based on the wooden decking that it had at first. Any vehicles going across it made it rumble. The gatehouse in the background, the new gatehouse in the background, was built for the new Croton Aqueduct in 1890. There was 3 times the volume, could handle 3 times the volume of the old aqueduct, and was needed immediately upon being pressed into service, and was almost out of date in about 15 or 20 years, after which the city built yet another aqueduct to take water from the Catskill Mountains. That's another story. Here's a Scientific American issue cover showing the foundation of that gatehouse, the 1890 gatehouse, and the intake that was built for it was carved out of a sheer rock facing. Probably thousands of tons of rock were removed to build that gatehouse. And the next photo shows an actual photograph of the foundation as it was being built in that large rock cut adjacent to the old dam, but ready to take the 300 million gallons of water and feed it into the new Croton Aqueduct starting in 1890. Here's a look at the spillway and part of the face of the new Croton Dam, built about 3.5 or 4 miles south of the old one, and a plaque on some granite there with the American Society of Civil Engineers paying homage to the 100 years of service of even the new Croton Dam in 2006. We'll do look at a few more photographs of this dam. This one is after Hurricane Irene in, I believe, 2011, showing the force of nature and the amount of water that can be delivered over the spillway of the Croton Dam. At the day this was taken, after the hurricane, I think 5 to 7 inches of water fell in the local Croton watershed. The plume of vapor was rising about 100 feet in the air from the bottom of the spillway, and people 100 yards away from it had to use umbrellas not to be soaked. It's also pretty thrilling to stand on the bridge during an event like that. You can feel it vibrating under your feet. So I invite anybody after our next big hurricane to go up to the Croton Dam and be terrified for a few minutes. Here's a good look at the face from the base of the Croton Dam, looking to the northern edge of it. And the next slide is looking from the opposite end at almost the full length of the Croton Dam with the spillway in the background. And I believe our next slide shows the spillway as it looked early in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, with some extra impoundment on a fence-like structure around the top of it that raised the level of the water in the reservoir another 3 or 4 feet to the tune of another 1 billion or 2 gallons. And the bridge that shows in this picture is the first bridge. We're now walking across on the third bridge to be there, which closely mirrors the design of the first one that lasted until the 1970s. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection actively maintains all the infrastructure on the bridge. And here we see a stone basin rappelling down the face of the Croton Dam to check its masonry structure. Of the 11 or 12 additional reservoirs built to impound Croton water from 1857 to 1910, the volume of Croton water to be impounded went up and up by billions of gallons of water. 30 billion can be held in the Croton Reservoir alone, and billions more in the other 11 or 12 reservoirs that the system contains. Just walking south, briefly south from the Croton Dam, if you jump off the trail, you can look at this stone embankment. The trail that this picture was taken from goes down into the Croton Gorge Park at the base of the dam, but the aqueduct is built within this stone wall. There are many examples of these on the trail. They're a very common sight, and they were used to build up and maintain the structures of the aqueduct was within. Mostly just loose rock, no mortar, just basically leaned into the hillside to maintain the structure. The next photograph, very well, showing one of the 114 culverts that were originally built. Some no longer exist because of modern construction, but this is a particularly good one, showing a 3 or 4 foot culvert built under the aqueduct to allow a natural stream to pass underneath it. Very finely cut stonework is in that brick, the stone arch beneath, and there's a relieving arch above that. I learned that that's what they're called from a preservation engineer and as part of the aqueduct group, and a particularly well restored or well maintained aqueduct embankment. Now, as we work our way down to Ossining, or on our aqueduct trip, we come to the Sing Sing Kill Arch, now known as the Double Arched Bridge in Ossining. The original design for it shows an 88-foot wide arch, making it the largest arch, the widest arch in the aqueduct system. There were 2 other smaller arches, one for a pedestrian passage and one for a street passage to its left. And there were hollow spaces below the top level with spandrel walls that were next to each other and left hollow spaces underneath the aqueduct for possible seepage from the aqueduct, and weep holes under the arch to let water that might leak out weep away from the aqueduct bridge and not damage it, instead of building up during freeze and thaw. And here's a design illustration showing how that worked. Those 4 white vertical spaces at the bottom are the hollow spaces, and spandrel walls and 3 on the inside directed any water that might leak out of the iron and brick lined aqueduct in this location from gathering on the inside of the arch. And the whole aqueduct was covered by 3 or 4 feet of earth at that time. Here's a view inside the aqueduct at that location, as it exists in many others. But this location in Ossining is the only place where the aqueduct is actually available to the public. We have not been scheduling tours during the COVID pandemic and during the winter, but it's outfitted with a metal grid to walk on and railings and electric lights that make it a favorite tour site for many people who have looked inside the aqueduct with us. And an exterior view of what it looks like today. There was a wooden trestle bridge instead of that brick arch that you see underneath. It was replaced in 1861 by this brick and stone bridge, recently renovated itself. The aqueduct runs in those 2 bands of stone up on the top, in the top arch. And as well, there is a walkway built in the gorge under the arch, a recent addition, which allows people during the summer or the winter to walk in the Croton Gorge and get a look at the aqueduct from below. And from this image, you can tell how substantial the foundations of the abutments are for the arch. This is an architectural drawing of the road culvert at the northern end of the aqueduct in Sing Sing. And it's a historic plan dating probably from about 1837. because we know the arch was constructed and completed by 1839. And the next photograph shows what it looks like today.
One second.
Yep. Here we go. During renovations of the Ossining Arch and Aqueduct about 7 or 8 years ago, the Aqueduct Street Arch was also renovated. A lot of weeds removed, a lot of remortaring of stonework, and a lot of waterproofing of the surface, which is now a public access way and part of the Old Croton Aqueduct Trail. And a side view of the aqueduct with the bridge underneath. We can go through these fairly quickly, Chad, thank you. And another view from a bit of a distance away, showing the size of the arch. And I know because people like celebrity and TV, we put a couple of slides in from the filming that took place in Ossining, within the weir and within the tunnel, of a TV show produced by the New York City TV station called Secrets of New York. The hostess of the show is shown in the middle with safety gear on, surrounded by New York State Parks officials who are going to accompany her into sections of the tunnel that are not normally open to the public. And because they're not, and because nobody could be sure about the breathability of the air farther into the tunnel, serious safety precautions had to be taken, including the harness she's wearing, which would have been attached to a rope that could have dragged her out of the tunnel were it necessary. It wasn't, so it wasn't a problem. And the next slide shows her with one of our board members on Friends of the Aqueduct, talking about the secret tunnel to New York City. And we can go to the next one. As we make our way south from Ossining, we get down into the Briarcliff Sleepy Hollow area. This was an actual road crossing on Route 9, known as Archville for obvious reasons. The aqueduct ran across the top of that arch, just under the bands of stonework on the top. It was taken down in the 1920s when automobiles began to be more prevalent. And unlike horses who would approach from opposite directions, automobiles piloted by human beings would race each other to see who could get through the tunnel first, leading to substantial and serious, even fatal accidents by drivers who did not know how to pilot their motorized vehicles very well in the early 1900s. The pipes were put underground at that point. Here's an architectural view from an early drawing and plan for it as well. So this is what the architects and draftsmen would have put together. Going further south from Sleepy Hollow, we enter the Picantico, or what used to be called the Mill River, where the highest embankment in the system exists. You can walk across it today, and we'll show a few photographs of that to you. It's about 87 feet high from the level of the surface of the water, about 55 or 60 feet of a foundation wall, another 12 feet under that of the large culvert, and another 8 or 10 feet above that of the aqueduct and its covering, for a total of close to 80 feet high. And this is another FB Tower drawing of it, and another architectural drawing of what the embankment looked like in a cutaway. The 55-foot high wall, about 10 feet of aqueduct, and 3 or 4 feet of earth covering over that, and not completely shown at the bottom is the another additional 10 feet of height of the culvert through that fairly large culvert. And here's a comparison of what it did look like then and what it looks like today, in remarkably good condition for its age, and lack of maintenance, of serious maintenance over the past 50 or 60 years. An aerial photograph in the 1970s shows the embankment without too many trees grown up on it, as opposed to how it looks today with many more trees growing all the way up to the top, to the point where you can hardly tell that it's a man-made structure unless you really know what you're walking across. And the next one, an early 20th century view of that same structure with gates and fences that made it safe for pedestrian passage. Bicyclists at the time complained about the turnstile, which they had to lift their bicycles over if they were touring the aqueduct when the gate was closed. Here's something you can do on the aqueduct today. This is in the vicinity of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery on one side of the Pocantico crossing, which we're looking at, and the Pocantico Rockefeller Preserve on the other. So all three things, the aqueduct, the cemetery, and the Rockefeller Preserve are all worth a visit if you're in the vicinity. And certainly a lot of people do take advantage of the ability to cross-country ski on it in the winter. The weir is also there, one of half a dozen in the system. And it was there were gatehouses basically built periodically on the aqueduct to empty the aqueduct out during inspections and repairs. And the one at Pocantico is in particularly good shape with a long spillway to its side, and it could empty the Croton Aqueduct into the Mill River when necessary for its semi-annual or annual inspections. Next one, Chuck. If we go a little farther south down into downtown Terrytown, we find embankment walls just off of Main Street, off of Route 9, Broadway in Terrytown. This one encloses the aqueduct at the end of a parking lot next to a supermarket and almost directly across from the Warner Library in Terrytown, where the aqueduct runs in most of Terrytown, about a block east of Broadway. And we'll take a little stop here in Dobbs Ferry, where we have our keeper's house. So I can plug the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct. This is the only keeper's house available to the public these days, restored at great cost over the last 5 years. It was one of the half a dozen keeper's houses built in 1857. It now houses a visitor and education center, closed during the pandemic, unfortunately, but it has a permanent exhibit describing the history of the aqueduct and a second room that contains a secondary and temporary exhibit on pretty much anything we want to show there periodically. Currently, there are pictures up on the wall, maps, pictures, and photographs that I helped to curate showing aspects of the aqueduct, similar to the tour we're taking today, but a little more detail. And the next two photographs we can go through fairly quickly, show what it looks like on the outside, and then during exterior renovations and interior renovations. It took our Friends of the Aqueduct about 10 years to get that job done, maybe more. And here's a panel, one panel, of which there are many, showing the permanent exhibit at the keeper's house, describing how the Croton Aqueduct is a gravity-fed water system, and some photographs from the 1880s showing the new Croton Aqueduct being built in similar fashion to what would have been used and built for the old aqueduct, only slightly more robust and slightly larger. Going down to Hastings, this is one of my favorite spots on the whole trail. If you jump off the aqueduct without breaking a leg, be careful, in the vicinity of the Rowley Bridge at the southern end of Hastings, you will see this embankment wall and a culvert with a reinforcing wall built over it with the Gothic arch built into it, none of which fits any plans or designs on the aqueduct. I think the contractors in the 1870s or 1880s, when they were reinforcing this embankment, may have just gotten bored and done what they knew how to do. I suspect they were probably stonemasons who knew how to build Gothic arches into churches at the time. But that's what it looks like today, and it's a beautiful, if unusual, addition to the aqueduct under this perfectly working culvert. Moving a little south from that, or possibly a little bit north, I'm sorry, shows the Hastings Quarry Bridge, which was also built into the aqueduct to allow a small stone quarry where marble was quarried at the time to get a small steam engine and flatbed railway into and out of the quarry so that their stones could be sent down to the river and put on barges and sent up and downstream to New York City. And the Quarry Park is now being renovated in Hastings after having been used as a garbage dump for many years. The project is going very well with the support, very active support of people in Hastings and one of our board members on Friends of the Aqueduct. And as you get to Yonkers, the Yonkers-Hastings border, the trail comes very close to the Hudson River. And from this elevation above the river, there's a beautiful view, one of the nicer views of the Hudson from the aqueduct as it wends its way south on its Hudson River route. And this one obviously from the fall. In Tibbetts Brook Park, the aqueduct actually runs down the eastern border of Tibbetts Brook Park from approximately the Cross County Parkway down to, I forget the name of the avenue where it actually enters the Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. But there were renovations done on that about 7 or 8 years ago as well. In Tibbetts Brook Park, rebuilding part of the foundation wall of the aqueduct, which here is in an embankment about 10 to 12 feet high. A little farther north than the Tibbetts Brook Park is the Nepperhan crossing, which of the aqueduct, which actually crossed the Sawmill River in 1842. And this is another F.B. Tower drawing from his book, showing the double culvert that allowed water, the Sawmill River, to go pass under the Croton Aqueduct and the narrow road bridge that existed there at the time. This has been modified a couple of times since then to enlarge the road bridge, and then later on to add even a wider road bridge a little farther to the left of this image. But it still stands. As we make our way down to the Bronx, the Jerome Avenue Reservoir was built along the western edge of the Croton Aqueduct, which is still there, but as part of the retaining wall on the east border of the Jerome Park Reservoir, built in the 1890s to early 1900s for a much larger supply of water to be retained closer to the city. And in this photograph, you see the Old Croton Aqueduct on the upper level of those openings, and a double conduit for the new Croton Aqueduct, which shows how much larger it was in scale at the time. This was a huge project at the time, covering, I think, perhaps enough area to hold 1 billion gallons of water. Working down the ridge of the Bronx, we come to Highbridge. Another tower illustration shows the Highbridge under construction. In the distance, in this north-looking view, there's a large plume of water shooting up from the Harlem River through the temporary siphon pipe that crossed the Harlem in 1842, and which took 6 more years to remove as the Highbridge was being completed. This is probably a very accurate view of what the Harlem looked like at the time. Natural shoreline, far out in the country from the city. On the upper left-hand corner, you can see the Morris Jumel Mansion, which was historically used by both George Washington's army and the British Army after he chased Washington's army out of New York City during the Revolution. It's worth a tour itself. The original configuration of the Highbridge as it looked in 1848 was the same as it looked in this photograph in 1855, or close to 1855, where there was a slight downward slope from the Bronx slide, and 2 36-inch water pipes brought all the water that was used in New York into the city. The gentleman with the top hat in the foreground is actually standing on the aqueduct route in Highbridge on the Manhattan side. And if you care to go down there today and walk across the renovated Highbridge, you can walk south on the Manhattan side and stand in this very same rock cut as this gentleman was standing in the 1850s. Architectural plans for the Highbridge were drawn and then revised. This one shows hollow spaces in the piers and in the spandrels between the arches. It was later modified to include only 50 or 80 feet wide arches. This particular drawing I know was an earlier one because it shows 2 arches of 60 and 70 feet width, and they were not built. I suspect John B. Jervis, as a very economical engineer, specified the formwork that was to be made and reused for each arch, that it would have saved money not to have to build one time only scaffolding for 60 and 70 foot wide arches. But again, the hollow spaces, similar to the arch in Ossining, were built in as a way of saving weight and materials. And again, an innovative kind of idea on how to build this old Roman aqueduct arch, but with some modern design elements. And they were weep holes and hollow spaces in the piers that reached down to the level of the water in the Harlem River that would have allowed any leakage to leak out of the aqueduct and not destroy the stonework. A gatehouse was posted at either end, built at either end of the Highbridge. And again, this is an early form of design showing 4 pipes going into the gatehouse. They only ever built 2. So not 4 pipes, but 2 entered the aqueduct on the Bronx side, then Westchester, and exited when it transformed back into a brick aqueduct on the Manhattan side. And the gatehouse designs are shown there as well. After 1890, there was another large bridge across the Harlem in the northern part of Manhattan, known as the Washington Bridge. And by that point, steel structures were not unusual. And this one large steel arch was thrown across the Harlem River for the Washington Bridge and shows the Highbridge in the background still in its more or less original form with the 50 and 80-foot arches. The natural shoreline on the right is where the Speedway and then the Harlem River Drive were later built. But by 1890, it still had a somewhat natural shoreline built into the rocky cliffs on the on the Manhattan side of the Highbridge. In 1860, a 90-inch pipe was built on top of the Highbridge, and this shows it being constructed. The 90-inch pipe probably allowed as much water as possible into the Croton Aqueduct, and after 1860 and after up to and through the 1870s to 1890, the aqueduct was overburdened with more water than it was designed to carry. As I said earlier, up to within 12 inches of the arch. So I think it led to a lot of maintenance questions and some cracking of the brickwork at that point. T.F. Rowland, whose name appears in the bottom of this image as the construction engineer, is the same engineer from Greenpoint, Brooklyn, who constructed the Monitor ironclad warship in the Civil War, immediately following his job putting this 90-inch wrought iron pipe on top of the Highbridge. And in popular culture, the Highbridge was still something that people understood and knew about because of its importance to the city. So there was a theatrical production in the early 20th century called Fallen Among Thieves, in which a woman on the stage would have dived from a platform into a tank of water, mimicking what is shown in the theater poster. I don't think this particular play ever won any awards, but I particularly like the Snidely Whiplash character skulking exit stage left as the plucky heroine dives from the top of the Highbridge to save her drowning friend. And the early 1900s showing steam engines going up what would be later become the Metro North Railroad tracks here at the New York Central. And we can go one more. The demolition of 5 of the arches in 1927 led to the building of a steel arch even on the Highbridge. So 1927 was a sad year, I think, because of the unnecessary, as I see it, destruction of 5 of these arches and the replacement of those arches with one steel arch, which we will see in the next slide. Here it is nearing completion and nearing the reinstallment of the 90-inch pipes, some of which are shown at the top with a large moving crane and one of the piers for the old Highbridge still holding up part of the superstructure for the traveling crane. Eugene de Salignac was a New York City photographer who took these 2 photographs and thousands of others over a 30-year period. And I'm going to give him a short plug right now in our next slide. After a couple more of Highbridge. It reopened in 2015, and this is a celebratory photograph of the reopening of Highbridge after being closed for approximately 45 or 50 years. Closed to the public, it is again available for pedestrian crossing in all the daylight hours. And this shows a crowd on this first day and from a different angle. and some of the ornamental ironwork that dates from 1860 has been repainted and restored as well, although there's a higher security fence now than there was before. People still are as reckless as they were in 1848. And here's the Eugene de Salignac photo that I wanted to show you in case you get can't think of the word. If you'd like to explore the New York City Municipal Archives website, you can look under Bridges, Plant, and Structure for this photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge with cable painters arrayed like musical notes on the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. Of all Eugene de Salignac's photos, this is probably the best known, but there are many others. And he was the photographer of those two photographs of the demolition of the arches on the Highbridge as well. And as we move farther south in Manhattan, skipping over some invisible parts of the aqueduct, in the 1840s, there was a visible part of it between 98th and 101st Street, where there was a shallow valley where an aqueduct bridge or three bridges were built with tunnels for traffic and pedestrian crossings, 98th, 99th, and 100th Street. There were plans for 6 originally, only 3 were built in the end. Again, a cost-saving measure by John B. Jervis. At the time, the crossings were built under the aqueduct, and we can go to the next slide, Chet. There were really no built-up neighborhoods in the area. Cows were probably, again, the most populous denizens of the area. The streets had not yet been laid out, although the crossings conformed to the grid plan layout of the streets of Manhattan at the time. So it was very sparse population, no real estate development in 1842. By 1870, the Clendening bridges had to be removed because they were offset from what became Columbus Avenue, about 100 feet to the west of Columbus, and they were in the way of modern real estate development by the 1870s. So they were demolished. The water moved in underground pipes on Columbus Avenue, and some of the stones from the Clendening Aqueduct went into the structure of St. Paul's Church on 60th Street and 9th Avenue. I believe the church has some documentation to that effect. Moving south from Upper West Side, the aqueduct, and we skipped over one little aspect of a receiving reservoir in what became Central Park, but it isn't great graphics. It's just a big expanse of 30 acres of water in a large rectangular reservoir, and is today filled in and known as the Great Lawn in Central Park. And south from there, iron pipes moved the water down Fifth Avenue to the distribution reservoir, shown here, a facade drawing of it, we think by draftsman James Renwick Jr., who worked for the aqueduct department at the time and later went on to design St. Patrick's Cathedral, as well as the first Smithsonian building in Washington, D.C., a building known as the Castle, which had been showing up recently in photographs of Washington, D.C.'s. I haven't made too many text blocks, but this is one worth looking at. Again, my favorite documenter at the time, Fayette Bartholomew Tower, the book author, poet, and artist, described water being let into the 42nd Street Reservoir on July 4th for the first time. And just listen to this, in a letter to his girlfriend, mind you, he used poetic language, describing an hour when the morning guns had aroused but few from their dreamy slumbers, and ere yet the rays of the sun had gilded the city domes. I stood upon the topmost wall of this reservoir and saw the first gush of the waters as they entered the bottom and wandered about, as if each particle had consciousness and would choose for itself a resting place in this palace towards which it had made a pilgrimage. Or I fancied I could recognize the water nymphs of the Croton, come from their rugged caverns to enjoy the refinements of a city residence. I would like to think that if I had a time machine, possibly the first person I would visit would be Fayette Bartholomew Tower. And here's an aerial view of the reservoir in the 1850s, showing a division wall down the center, which was part of the design, enabling some redundancy of supply if one part had to be emptied and repaired. And next to it, a large greenhouse type structure of iron and glass called the Crystal Palace, which was America's attempt to mimic the British Crystal Palace a few years before, something done in Queen Victoria's reign. The Crystal Palace in New York is on the site of where Bryant Park would be today, and it burned down in 1857. It was fireproof itself as a structure, but unfortunately its contents were not. And view of the reservoir before its demolition in 1900, no automobiles visible on the street. And the New York Public Library, which replaced it in 1911, here showing still horses and carriages, trolley cars, and one vehicle which may be electric or gasoline powered just to the left of the lamppost on Fifth Avenue. This photograph is interesting for the fact that it also shows the retaining wall or boundary wall of the old reservoir still there in 1911, before the lions were added to the main entrance and before a marble wall and promenade was built around the library itself. And I think our next slide is basically a list of bibliographic list of places you may want to look at, including the F.B. Tower book. I would consider that the primary source primary source of interest for anybody who wants to explore it further. And it's available on a couple of digital library websites called archive.org or hathitrust.org. You can probably also order a printed version of it from Google Books. There are a few other sources here as well, and a few other books, both old and new, that are worth looking at, including the New York City Municipal Archives, the Flickr website of the New York City Department of Archives, and the Library of Congress, and a website called nyheritage.org, a compendium of historical archives around the state, one of which is the Jervis Library, whose drawings in the Jervis collection are available if you use the word Jervis drawings in quotes when you search that site. And Chuck, Chad, I think I'm ready for Q&A if anybody if nobody has fallen asleep.
Oops.
I have a question that I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, the ventilators. I read that it says fresh water. I actually got two questions.
Yep.
The first one is the ventilators. They're used to bring fresh air so the water doesn't get, I guess, rancid or anything. But is it also used, are the ventilators also used to allow the water to get transported across the aqueduct? Is there like two purposes?
I think the secondary purpose would probably be to equalize the air pressure in the aqueduct if the water level rose or fell. Because the aqueduct was not built to be a pressurized conduit, they wanted to keep the air pressure at nominal pounds per square inch. So they wanted it at atmospheric pressure at all times. And if it were a sealed system and the water level fell, it could lead to the aqueduct imploding by inside.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, you showed the picture of the gentleman rappelling down the side of the dam. And
Correct.
you said that they do that frequently. I'm not sure how you characterize it, but how often do they do that?
Probably every time they do a major construction project or are anticipating one, they will inspect all the structures in the entire water system, not just the Croton system, and see what kind of condition the engineering is and decide how to proceed from there on how extensive a renovation is required. The repelling stonemason that you saw in that photograph was inspecting the face of the dam for a recent modernization of the gatehouse equipment that is attached to the dam itself.
Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
Go ahead. Who's got the next question?
I have a quick question. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was excellent. I noticed that when you're hiking, south from the Croton Dam, that the first ventilator is labeled number 4. Is
Yep.
there any particular reason why it's not labeled number 1?
Yes, because 3 of them are buried under the Croton Reservoir.
Okay, that's what
The original dam and the first 3 miles of the aqueduct trail are submerged
Okay.
in the waters of the New Croton Reservoir. So they may or may not still exist. I suspect they were probably demolished when the original 3 miles of the northern reaches of the aqueduct were submerged under the reservoir. In fact, I know that for a fact that part of the original 3 miles were reinforced and rebuilt from the new Croton Dam back to the old gatehouse, the 1890 gatehouse.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
We have a question from Leonard Andrew. Leonard, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You can unmute yourself.
Well, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. There's an awful lot of stone used.
Huge
Where did
amounts.
all that come from, and how was it cut so finely?
Stone cutting was a fairly arduous but practiced skill among craftsmen at that time. Most of the stone came from local quarries, especially all the embankment stone and any of the rubble around the sides of the aqueduct that reinforced it. Almost all of it came from local quarries, except possibly some of the stonework in the original Croton Dam, which might have required slightly higher quality. So a small amount of it might have been imported from the upper reaches of the Hudson Highlands. And I know that the New Croton imported the facing stones on the dam from out of state in many cases, upstate and from as far away as Vermont.
Where were the local quarries?
Probably very small ones and all around the route of the aqueduct. Some of the ventilator towers are made of marble, and a lot of those could have been quarried from the marble quarry in Ossining, the same marble quarry that the prisoners built their own prison from in Sing Sing. But a lot of small quarries, Tilly Foster and a number of others whose names and locations may not be known in current records.
Thank
Tom,
you.
there's a question in the chat. I'm curious how long it would take for water from the Croton Reservoir to reach the reservoir on Fifth Avenue on the day the aqueduct was opened.
The speed I have at which the water moved was at about 2 to 2.5 miles an hour. And so it would be about 1.5 to 2 days for water first entering the aqueduct at the dam, flowing through the aqueduct and exiting either at the reservoir in Central Park or at the distribution reservoir on 42nd Street. About a 2-day journey.
So Howard Weiss, if you could unmute yourself, Henry, excuse me, I apologize, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your Sunday with us. I'm in Palm Springs, California, but I lived in Irvington for a while. My question is, the project apparently generated a reasonable amount of revenue. Was that revenue shared with the communities along the Hudson?
No, it was not. The revenues were all paid to go on to continue increasing the distribution system that had to be built as houses in New York City were hooked up to the water system. So at first, very few people were hooked up, almost none, as a matter of fact. In the first year of water delivery, the city received less than 20 million gallons of water from the Croton Aqueduct. But gradually, year by year, as water pipes were laid under the streets of New York City, and as the city grew northward up to 42nd Street and beyond, more and more water was let into the aqueduct, all of which led to more fees or rental fees for the water to be used. Everybody that used the water in New York City paid for it, and that generated enough income to basically fund the building and expansion of the water system itself, as it does today. Everyone in New York, commercial and private, pays a water bill in New York, and it makes the Department of Environmental Protection one of the few self-funding agencies in New York. They have to borrow a lot less money than most, or be dependent on a lot less budget money than most other agencies.
Tom,
you.
there's a question in the chat. You briefly mentioned the Jerome Park Reservoir. Could you
Yep.
further elaborate on its integration into the Croton Aqueduct? Is it still actively used and maintained?
It is. And in fact, there's a more convoluted route for the water now than there was 10 years ago. With the building of a filtration plant in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx to filter every drop of Croton water, the water first is led from the aqueduct into the Jerome Park Reservoir and then fed back in a northerly direction to the filtration plant and then fed back into the aqueduct from there to come to New York City. So the water in the Jerome Park Reservoir today, all billion or 2 billion gallons of it, is water that has not yet been treated. And there was a large project over the past 15 years to build that filtration plant at great expense. Billion or more dollars. Nothing costs less than $1 billion these days.
Tom, there's another question in the chat about removing vegetation from above the Station Road tunnel. Do the tree roots, et cetera, threaten the integrity of the stonework?
It is my opinion, and I think the opinions of any engineer, that they do. Occasionally, the New York State Parks, which now owns the aqueduct, will do some tree clearing on it, but probably not enough to protect the embankment to the degree that it needs.
Tom, another question. What was the state of water in New York City before the aqueduct? What was the source of the water?
It was execrable, deadly, and disgusting to drink. One of the complaints first voiced by New York City residents when they first had access to Croton water was that it had no flavor. And it usually gets a laugh. But the water in New York could literally kill you in New York in 1834 to 1842. Cholera epidemics were not unknown. In 1832, 5,000 people died in the summer out of a population less than 300,000. So if you think of the COVID epidemic today being deadly, imagine what it meant to New Yorkers who could not escape the city during cholera in 1832. There is at least one letter I've found by one of the engineers working on the Croton system before he went to work for the Croton system, talking about how dangerous it was and how he elected to remain in the city, where if he did get sick from cholera, he could be within reach of some assistance. So he did not flee to a place north of the city where he might not have been able to get any help if he got sick.
Tom, we're going to do one more question, and then I'm going to turn over to Veronica in a minute. But the final question is, were there ever rumors or even credible threats of poisoning of the waters? I'm wondering particularly during the First and Second World Wars.
It goes back to the Civil War. There were alleged plots by people who wanted to blow up the Highbridge to deprive New York City of water, even during the Civil War. And extra police were mounted on the Highbridge to prevent the possibility of that. And again, in 1917, when the Highbridge Aqueduct and the Croton Aqueduct were still active, the National Guard was called out, or the National Militia, to guard both the Croton Aqueduct and the newly opened Catskill Aqueduct, delivering water from the Catskills. Many of those militia members died in the pandemic of 1918, 1919. So yeah, there were threats all along.
Tom, thank you very much. I think we're probably at a good stopping point. Veronica, maybe if you had a few, unmute yourself, Veronica, and then we could, there you go.
Here I am. Can you hear me, Chet?
Yes.
Oh, that was wonderful, Tom. That was real. Those beautiful structures. Thank you for sharing them with us. And thank you, Sarah and Chet, for putting the program together. And thank you all for joining us today. If you've missed any of our recent programs, they've been posted on our website, so you can catch them later. And we have more to come. Next month, on February 28th, we'll present the history of Villa Lewaro, the home of Madam C.J. Walker. And on March 21st, please join us for one on Amzie Barber, the Asphalt King, and the development of Ardsley Park. these online programs have been terrific, but we all look forward to meeting again in person and welcoming you all back to the History Center to share our next exhibit.